I didn't expect to see her there. It was one of those quiet, half-forgotten afternoons when I slipped into the little bookstore cafe on the corner, the one where the shelves smelled of dust and the coffee always tasted faintly of cinnamon. I came looking for a pocket of calm, maybe a book to lose myself in. What I found instead was a piece of my past, standing just a few feet away, turning over the worn pages of a poetry collection. Her, my old teacher. She hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. There was still the quiet elegance in the way she held herself, the soft patience in her movements. But there was something else, too, something time had added. A gravity in her eyes, a touch of weariness in her posture, like life had pressed its weight on her shoulders, and yet she carried it gracefully. Her hair, darker now with streaks of silver woven in, caught the soft light pouring through the window. I froze for a moment, caught somewhere between the boy who once sat in her classroom and the man standing here now, watching her. She lifted the book from the shelf, her lips moving silently, as if tasting the words before they ever reached her voice. And then, almost too suddenly, our eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, surprise first, then warmth. "You," she said softly, tilting her head, her voice carrying that same calm authority I remembered. "I didn't think I'd ever run into you again." I smiled, a little awkward, a little relieved. I could say the same. We met in the space between shelves, surrounded by rows of forgotten novels and whispered stories. She held the book against her chest, as though it was a shield, but her eyes softened when she looked at me. We spoke politely at first, catching up, brushing over the years we had both lived apart. I told her about my work, about trying to find my place in the world. She told me about the classes she still taught, about how the younger students never seemed to read with the same hunger anymore. There was a pause then, a pause that wasn't awkward but full. I noticed her glasses slipping slightly down her nose, and before I could stop myself, I said, "You still read like the words are alive." Her laugh was quiet, a breath more than a sound, but it reached me. At one point, we both reached for the same book on the table between us, a copy of Rilke's poems, and our fingertips brushed. It was such a small thing, so ordinary. And yet in that moment, the world seemed to narrow into the warmth of her skin against mine. We both drew back quickly, as though the touch had startled us, but I caught the faintest curve of a smile on her lips. And it was then that I realized she wasn't just my teacher anymore. She was a woman who, even after all these years, still had the power to quiet a room simply by being in it. And for the first time, I wondered if I had just stepped into a story I wasn't ready to leave. After a moment's hesitation, she suggested we sit down for coffee. The bookstore cafe wasn't crowded that afternoon. The low hum of jazz filled the space, mingling with the soft clatter of cups and spoons. We chose a corner table tucked beneath a window where the light spilled across the wood in golden strips. She set her book down between us, a shield turned offering, and I noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she reached for her cup. It wasn't nerves exactly, more like the weight of being seen, of letting someone notice the cracks she usually kept hidden. Our conversation started lightly, as most do. Work, old classmates, fragments of memory from the classroom, the projects I had stumbled through, the way she once stayed after hours to help me rewrite an essay I thought was hopeless. We laughed at that, and the sound of her laughter, lower, softer than I remembered, stayed with me long after the moment passed. But then, the words turned deeper, as though some invisible thread pulled us there. She admitted she hadn't been reading for pleasure as much as she used to. "These days, I feel like I'm teaching out of habit more than passion," she said, her voice low, her gaze lingering on the steam rising from her tea. "It's as if I've become invisible in my own story." The word struck me harder than I expected. I had always seen her as untouchable, composed, someone with answers tucked neatly into the margins of every book. Yet here she was, confessing her own doubts, letting me glimpse the vulnerability she never revealed in a classroom full of students. I leaned in, elbows on the table, closing the distance between us. Invisible, I said gently. I don't think you've ever been invisible. Not to me. Her eyes lifted then, meeting mine, sharp at first, searching as if testing whether I meant it. When she saw that I did, something softened in her expression. The moment hung there, fragile and heavy. Her glasses fogged slightly from the steam of her tea, and she laughed, embarrassed, removing them to wipe them clean. The gesture was so small, so human, and yet it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I noticed how the light caught on the silver in her hair, how her fingers traced the rim of her cup when she searched for words. She wasn't performing for anyone here. She wasn't a teacher delivering lessons. She was simply herself, thoughtful, graceful, quietly aching to be seen. As she spoke, her hand drifted across the table, almost unconsciously, and for a second, it rested close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But the air between us pulsed with the suggestion that maybe one day soon I would. We stayed like that, two people caught in a conversation that seemed to stretch beyond time, where every word revealed something truer than the last. And as the cafe grew quieter around us, I realized something undeniable. She was no longer just part of my past. She was becoming part of my present. And if I was honest with myself, I wanted her in my future too. When the cafe closed for the evening, neither of us seemed ready to part ways. She suggested a walk, just a short one, she said, and I agreed without hesitation. The city outside was caught in that soft, lingering glow after sunset. Street lamps blinked awake one by one, their halos reflecting off the damp pavement where a light drizzle had passed earlier. We walked side by side, her heels clicking steadily against the sidewalk, my steps falling into rhythm with hers. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things, her lesson plans, the students who both amused and exasperated her, the books I had been meaning to read but never found time for. But beneath the words, there was an undercurrent, a pull we both felt but neither of us dared name. At one point, the sidewalk narrowed. Without thinking, I stepped closer to her so we wouldn't brush against the passing crowd. My shoulder nearly touched hers, and when my hand brushed against the back of hers, the contact was fleeting, but it lingered in me like a spark. She noticed. I knew she did, because her steps faltered for half a beat, and her breath caught before she quickly smoothed her expression. She looked ahead, but her voice softened when she said, almost teasingly, "Careful. This feels suspiciously like a date." I smiled, trying to match her lightness, but my answer betrayed me. "Maybe it does." She gave a short laugh, but it didn't carry the carefree ease of before. Instead, it sounded like she was buying time, creating space she wasn't sure she wanted. She glanced at me then, just long enough to let me see the conflict in her eyes, a tug-of-war between restraint and desire. For a few steps, silence stretched between us. The kind of silence where every sound around us, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves stirred by the night breeze, seemed amplified, as though the world itself was listening. Finally, she spoke again, her voice lower this time. "You shouldn't look at me like that." I hadn't realized how intently I'd been watching her. The way the streetlight painted soft gold across her profile, the way her lips pressed together like she was holding back more than words. "How am I looking at you?" I asked quietly. She shook her head, her smile small, almost pained. "Like you've forgotten I was your teacher once." The truth was I had. Or maybe I hadn't forgotten, but I no longer saw her through the lens of the past. I saw her now, in this moment, as the woman walking beside me. A woman whose nearness pulled at me with a force I couldn't deny. I didn't argue, though. I only let the silence speak for me. And as we reached the corner where our paths would eventually split, I realized something unsettling. She was right. This did feel like a date. Every glance, every pause, every accidental touch carried the weight of something more. And though neither of us had said it out loud yet, we both knew we were standing dangerously close to a line, one neither of us was entirely sure we wanted to step away from. When we finally reached the corner where our paths were supposed to part, I thought she would say a quick goodbye and walk away. That would have been the safe thing to do, the right thing. But instead, she lingered. Her hand tightened on the strap of her bag, her eyes fixed on the glow of the street lamp above us. The air was cooler here, the breeze carrying a faint scent of lilacs from a nearby garden. For a moment, the city felt hushed, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I wanted to say something, anything, to fill the silence between us. But before I could, she stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Her voice came then, a whisper, almost lost to the wind. "You're crossing the line." The words weren't sharp, not the reprimand they might have once been in a classroom. They trembled with something else. Longing, maybe fear, maybe both. It was the kind of whisper that pulled you in, made you want to lean closer just to catch every syllable. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse quickening beneath my collar. For a moment, I thought about stepping back, giving her space, proving that I respected whatever invisible boundary she needed. But I couldn't. Not when her eyes finally lifted to meet mine, full of conflict, full of questions she hadn't spoken aloud. I swallowed hard, then let the words slip out, softer than I intended, but truer than anything I'd ever said. "You drew it closer." Her breath caught. I heard it, saw the way her lips parted as if she wanted to reply, but couldn't find the words. The night wrapped around us, heavy with a silence that wasn't empty but charged, alive with everything we weren't saying. She broke eye contact first, glancing down, her hand brushing the side of her coat as if to steady herself. "You shouldn't," she began, but her voice faded, unfinished. And all I could think was how fragile and strong she looked at the same time. A woman who had always seemed untouchable to me, now standing close enough that I could see the faint tremor in her hands, close enough that the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air between us. I didn't touch her. Not yet. But I wanted to. God, I wanted to. My hand ached with the restraint of keeping it at my side, when all I wanted was to brush back the stray strand of hair that had slipped across her cheek. Instead, I just stood there, letting the weight of my words hang between us. She looked up again then, her eyes glistening, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt as if she was about to close the distance herself. But she didn't. She stepped back instead, her composure slipping into place like a carefully drawn curtain. "Good night," she whispered, softer now, almost tender. And then she turned, leaving me standing under the street lamp with my heart still racing, knowing nothing between us would ever be the same again. The days after that night felt strangely hollow. We had stood on the edge of something close enough to touch it, and then she had stepped away. And now, so had I. Weeks slipped by without a word between us. I told myself it was for the best, that lines existed for a reason, that silence was easier than temptation. But the truth was simpler and heavier. I missed her. At night, I'd sit by my window with a book in my lap, the rain streaking down the glass in uneven lines, and realize I hadn't read more than a page. My mind wandered back to her, to the sound of her laugh, to the way her eyes softened when she let her guard down, to that whisper that still echoed in my chest. "You're crossing the line." She haunted me in the quiet moments. At the market one afternoon, I saw her across the aisle, her hair pulled back, her basket half full of groceries. For an instant, I thought about walking over, about pretending to need something from the same shelf. But the weight of unspoken words pinned me still. Our eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow. She gave the faintest smile, not polite, not distant, but almost wistful. And then she turned, leaving me staring at the space she had left behind. I wondered if she was fighting the same battle I was. She must have been, because I knew her well enough to imagine it. The way she'd grip the edge of her desk when her mind wandered during class, or the way she'd pause halfway through grading papers, her pen hovering as though her thoughts had drifted elsewhere. To me, I thought about what she'd said at the cafe, about feeling invisible, and it struck me that maybe I was the only one who truly saw her now. Not as the teacher she once was, but as the woman she had become, layered, complex, still carrying fire beneath her quiet grace. The longing grew heavier each day, pressing against my chest in ways I couldn't ignore. I replayed our last conversation in my head again and again, like a scene I couldn't let go of. The whisper, the glance, the way she almost stayed, almost stepped closer, almost let herself fall. And then, the cruelest part, the distance hadn't made the feelings fade. It had only sharpened them, like a hunger that deepened the longer it was denied. I realized something then. She could retreat behind her walls, and I could let the silence stretch between us forever. But neither of us had truly walked away. Not in spirit. We were orbiting the same unspoken truth, waiting for one of us to close the distance. And I knew, with a certainty that left me restless, that if we crossed paths again, I wouldn't be able to let her slip away so easily. Not again. It happened on a night I least expected. I hadn't planned to see her again. Not so soon. Not while the air between us was still thick with everything unsaid. But life has a way of placing us exactly where we're meant to be. There was a seminar at the university, a late evening talk on literature and memory. I almost didn't go, but something nudged me, and when I walked into the small lecture hall, there she was. She sat near the middle, pen poised above her notebook, though I noticed her handwriting never quite filled the page. Her eyes lifted the moment I entered, and for the briefest instant, the careful mask she wore slipped. Surprise. Relief. Maybe even something closer. I slid into the seat beside her, trying to act casual, though my heart was beating faster than the steady hum of the overhead lights. She didn't turn away this time. Instead, after a moment, she whispered, "I thought you'd forgotten me." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the truth was so far from her fear. I couldn't forget you if I tried. For the rest of the seminar, I barely heard a word the speaker said. My attention drifted to the way her fingers tapped absently against her notebook, the way her perfume carried a soft, familiar warmth, the way her arm brushed mine when she shifted in her chair. Each small contact felt deliberate, though I knew it wasn't. Still, I didn't move away. Neither did she. When the talk finally ended, we stayed seated as the room emptied. The silence between us was no longer avoidance. It was anticipation. She stared down at her notebook, then closed it gently, folding her hands on top as though bracing herself. I told myself I'd keep my distance, she admitted, her voice low, trembling in its honesty. That what happened that night was a mistake. I leaned in, close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. Do you believe that? She hesitated. Her lips parted, then pressed shut, then opened again as if she was fighting with herself. Finally, her eyes met mine, unshielded, vulnerable. "No," she whispered. "I don't." Something shifted inside me, then, breaking open all the restraint I had been carrying. Slowly, deliberately, I reached beneath the table and let my hand find hers. For a heartbeat, she stayed still, her fingers cool and unmoving. Then, as if giving in to something she had been holding back for far too long, her hand turned, her fingers lacing with mine. The warmth of her touch spread through me, grounding and electric all at once. She didn't look away. Neither did I. And in that shared gaze, there was no teacher, no student, no lines drawn or crossed. There was only us, two people finally admitting what we had been circling for so long. Around us, the seminar room faded into background noise. Chairs scraping, voices murmuring, doors closing. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the truth we had finally allowed ourselves to touch. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt certain we weren't standing on opposite sides of a line anymore. We were crossing it together. We left the seminar together, stepping out into the cool night air. The sky was clear now, the rain from earlier gone, leaving the streets glistening as though the city had been polished clean. Street lamps stretched long reflections across the pavement, and the air carried the faint sweetness of lilacs drifting from a garden nearby. Neither of us spoke at first. Our hands were still linked, quietly, almost shyly, as though we were afraid to acknowledge the simplicity of what we had finally allowed. But the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was warm, steady, filled with something new. At the edge of the courtyard, she stopped. Her hand slipped from mine, only so she could turn and face me fully. Her expression was softer than I had ever seen it, stripped of all the careful composure she usually carried. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "that maybe this isn't fair. To you, to me, to the way the world might see us." I let out a quiet breath, not out of frustration, but understanding. I had thought of those things too, the judgment, the whispers, the doubt. But as I looked at her, standing in the glow of the street lamp with her hair catching the light, all I felt was clarity. "I don't care how they see us," I told her gently. "I only care how I see you. And when I look at you, I see the one person who makes me feel like I've found something worth holding on to." For a moment, I thought she might argue, retreat again behind the wall she had built so carefully. But instead, her shoulders eased and a quiet, almost relieved smile touched her lips. And she stepped closer, just enough for her to rest her head against my chest. The motion was unhurried, deliberate. Not a question this time, but an answer. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the curve of her shoulders fit against me, feeling the steadiness of her heartbeat align with mine. Her breath warmed the fabric of my shirt as she whispered, "You're dangerous, you know that?" I laughed softly, my chin brushing the top of her hair. "Why?" "Because you make me forget all the reasons I built those lines in the first place." I held her tighter, my voice barely above a murmur. "Maybe you didn't build them to keep me out. Maybe you built them to see if someone would care enough to cross." She didn't answer right away, but the way her arms tightened around me, the way she lingered there against my chest, was answer enough. We stayed like that until the night grew quieter, until the last students left the building and the world seemed to leave us alone in our small, private universe. And when we finally began to walk again, her hand slipped naturally back into mine, as though it had always belonged there. We didn't rush. We didn't need to. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The line between us no longer divided. It had become the very path we walked on, side by side.